Chapter 8, Part 1, 2, and 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 8, Parts 1, 2, and 3. The Foundation of the Athenian Empire. Section 1. The Position of Sparta and Career of Pausanias. The Persian War, in its effects on Greece, illustrates the operation of a general law which governs human societies. Pressure from without, whether on a nation or a race, tends to promote unity and cohesion within. In the case of a nation, the danger of foreign attack increases the sense of unity among individual citizens and strengthens the central power. In the case of a race, it tends to weld the individual communities into a nation or a federation. In the latter case, the chance of realizing a complete or permanent unity depends partly on the strength and the duration of the external pressure, partly upon the degree of strength in the instinct for independence which has hitherto hindered the political atoms from cohesion. The Persian danger produced a marked tendency towards unity, but the pressure was acute only for a few years, and lasted in any form only for a few decades, and therefore that tendency was arrested, and the instinct for independence resumed its uncontested sway, before any scheme of Pan-Hellenic federal government had become necessary. On the coast of Asia, where the danger was permanent, an union came into existence. Now on these principles a philosopher might have predicted that an Hellenic union, whether whole or partial, whether of short or of long duration, would follow the repulse of the Persians. He might have predicted that such a great joint effort would react upon the domestic development of the victorious peoples. But no one could have foreseen what the shape of the union would take, or how the reaction would be directed. The course of Grecian affairs entered upon a new and unexpected way. For the last 40 years Sparta had been the predominant power in continental Greece. She had become the head of a Peloponnesian league, and had intervened with effect in Greek affairs beyond the limits of the Peloponnesus. Her headship in the common resistance to Persia was recognized without murmur or dispute by the allies of northern Greece. In fact, her peninsular league may be said to have widened into the Pan-Hellenic confederacy of the Isthmus. Her admirals had been commanders-in-chief at Salamis and at Mycale, and, if it were said that those naval victories could not be ascribed to Lacedaemonian skill or enterprise, Sparta could point to Thermopylae, where her king had been gloriously defeated, to Cytharion, where her general and her spearsmen had won what was, after all, the decisive contest of the war. A political prophet would therefore have been tempted to predict that Sparta, universally acknowledged before the war to be the leading state of Greece, would after the war be able to convert leadership into dominion. A great national enterprise, conducted under her auspices to a splendid conclusion, must immensely increase the moral strength of her position, and might justly stimulate her ambition. Moral power, by dexterous management, can soon be converted into material strength. In short, after the battle of Platae, the Greek world seemed to lie at Sparta's feet. If such calculations were made, they were doomed to disappointment. Lacedaemon had not the means, and the Lacedaemonian government had not the brains or the spirit to create the means, of carrying out an effective imperial policy. For a state which aspired to a truly imperial position in Greece must inevitably be a sea power. This was determined by the geographical and commercial conditions of the Greek world. So long as the Agean Greeks belonged to the Persian dominion, so long as the eastern waters of the Agean were regarded as a Persian sea, Sparta might indeed hold a dominant position as a Hellas thus restricted. But when the world of free Hellenic states once more extended over the Aegean Sea to the skirts of Asia and to Thrace, Sparta, unless she became a sea power, could not extend her influence over this larger sea-bound Greece. She might retain her continental position, but her prestige must ultimately be eclipsed and her power menaced by any city which won imperial authority over the islands and coasts of the Aegean. This was what happened. The Spartans were a people unable to adapt themselves to new conditions. Their city, their constitution, their spirit were survivals from medieval Greece. The government was conservative, by tradition, reforms were unwelcome, a man of exceptional ability was regarded with suspicion. They continued to drill their hoplites in the 5th century as they had done in the 6th. The formation of a navy would have seemed to them as unpractical an idea as an expedition against the capital of Persia. And if we follow their conduct of the recent war, we see that their policy was petty and provincial. They had generally acted at the last moment. They had never shown the power of initiation. Their view was so limited by the smaller interests of the Peloponnesians that again and again they almost betrayed the national cause. Failing to share in the progress of Greece, utterly wanting in the imperial instinct and the quality of imagination which accompanies it, the city of Lacedaemon was not marked out to achieve a political union of the Hellenic states. She was, however, able to prevent a rival from achieving it, but not before that rival had completely thrown her into the shade. Unfortunately, the events of the years succeeding the battle of Platae are but very slightly known. Herodotus, who, about half a century later, completed the story, compact of fiction and history, of the Persian War, ends his work at the capture of Sestos. In the meantime, the events of that full and momentous half-century had not been recorded, except by bits and scraps. The dates became confused, the details were forgiven, and when Thucydides, some years after Herodotus, came to investigate the history of this period, the result of his research was a meagre narrative, in a very uncertain chronological setting. The growth of the Athenian Empire is the central fact of the period, but before tracing it we must pause, it will not be for long, over the misfortunes of Sparta. Pausanias, the son of Cleombrotus, had shown, it must be allowed, remarkable military ability in conducting the campaign of Platae. But his talents as a politician were not equal to his talents as a general. Leaping into fame by his victory, he was led into attempting to play a part for which he was too slight a man. Sparta sent him out, in command of a squadron of ships supplied by her allies, to continue the work of emancipating the Eastern Greeks. He sailed first to Cyprus, and was successful in delivering the greater part of the island from Persian rule. He then proceeded to Byzantium and expelled the Persian garrison. But here his conduct became ambiguous. He began to play a game of his own. He connived at the escape of some kinsmen of Xerxes who were in the city, and he committed various acts of insolence and oppression to the Greeks. He behaved more as a tyrant than as a general, and he completely ruined all chances that his country had of remaining at the head of the confederacy which the Persian invasion had called into being. The Eastern Greeks placed themselves under the protection and headship of Athens. This step was inevitable. The maritime power of Athens marked her out to be a leader in the prosecution of the war beyond the sea. But the conduct of Pausanias at Byzantium may well have been the occasion of the formal transference of the leadership of the confederacy from Sparta to Athens. At Sparta itself the reports of the doings of the general aroused alarm and anxiety. He was recalled to answer the charges. It was said that he wore Persian dress and was attended by an Asiatic bodyguard in his journey through Thrace. For he had indeed been intriguing with the Persian court. The victor of Platae offered to enslave his own city and the rest of Hellas to Xerxes, and to seal the compact by marrying his daughter. His overtures were welcomed by the great king, and Pausanias, being a small man and elated by vanity, was unable to refrain from betraying in little things his treacherous designs. The Persian intrigue, however, could not at this time be proved against him. He was punished only for some acts of injury which he had done to particular persons. He was not sent out again, but he subsequently hired a trireme for himself, and returned to the scene of his former intrigue. He resumed possession of Byzantium, and thus controlled the inner gate of the Euxine, and he succeeded almost immediately in capturing Sestos, which gave him control of the outer gate also. This was too much for Athenians who were extending their political and commercial interests in these regions, and they sent out a squadron under Cimon, the son of Miltiades, who recovered Sestos and drove Pausanias out of Byzantium. Spartan government, hearing that he was intriguing in the Troad, sent a herald commanding him to return home. He obeyed the summons, believing that he could compass an acquittal by bribes. But it seems that he was already devising a daring and dangerous plan against the constitution of his own city. The ephors threw him into prison, but it was difficult to procure evidence of his guilt. He was released and challenged inquiry. Everybody knew that he had not only negotiated with Persia, but that he had prepared the way for a revolt of the Helots by promising them emancipation. He dreamed of converting the Spartan state into a true monarchy. But there were not clear enough proofs to act upon, until a confidential servant turned informer. Pausanias had entrusted him with a letter to Artabazus, but the man, who had noticed that none of the messengers who had been previously dispatched on the same errand ever returned, broke the seal, and read in the letter the order for his death. He showed the letter to the ephors, and they, wishing to have proof against Pausanias from his own mouth, contrived a stratagem. A hut with a partition was erected at the sanctuary of Taenarus. They concealed themselves in one room, and the man remained in the other, a suppliant. Pausanias came to discover why he was there. The man told him of the letter and reproached him. In the conversation, Pausanias admitted the whole truth. But he received a hint of his danger, and fled to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House. He took refuge in a small covered building adjoining the shrine. The ephors had the doors built up and starved him to death. As he was dying, they brought him out, and by the command of the Delphic god he was buried at the entrance to the sacred enclosure. But the starvation within the precincts was an offense against the goddess, and brought a curse upon the Spartans. To expiate this, they dedicated 2 brazen statues to Athena of the Brazen House. Though the adventures of Pausanias are of no great consequence, his career is typical of the Spartan abroad, and it throws some light on years of which we know very little. The Spartan government had sent out another general to replace Pausanias in the Hellespont, but the allies would have no more dealings with Spartan generals, and Sparta made no further attempt to win back the allegiance which the Aegean and Asiatic Greeks had transferred to Athens. On the other hand, she made some attempts at extending her power on the mainland, and forming a continental federation. She cast her eyes upon Thessaly, and perhaps hoped that if she brought the far north under her sway, she could extend her influence southward to the Thracian Gulf, and form a Lacedaemonian empire on the basis of the Amphictyon League of northern Greece. She sent forth an army under King Leotychidas, who landed in the Pagasean Bay, and showed that he could have easily subjugated the Thessalonian states. But like many a Spartan general, he could not resist silver and gold, and the allied princes saved their power by bribing the invader. His guilt was evident, and when he returned home he was condemned to death. He saved himself by fleeing to Tegea, where Athena's sanctuary was ever the refuge of a Spartan king in the day of danger. It is possible that Sparta gained some influence in Thessaly by this enterprise, in which she employed the Peloponnesian fleet, but she made no conquest. Nor did her attempt to reorganize the Amphictyonic federation prosper better. She proposed to expel from this league all the states that had joined the Mede. This was aimed at Thebes and Thessaly, and even the states which had not joined the federation against the Mede. This was aimed at Argos. But through the influence of Themistocles, who represented Athens, the proposal was thrown out. The activity of Themistocles in defeating the designs of Sparta at this period is reflected in the story that he tried to induce the Athenians to set fire to the Peloponnesian fleet in Thessalian waters. Sparta was unable to prosecute any further plans of empire beyond her own peninsula. She was soon compelled to fight for her position within the Peloponnesus itself. Argos had now recovered somewhat from the annihilating blow which had been dealt her by King Cleomenes, and was entering upon a new constitutional development which was ultimately to shape itself into a democracy. Most of the small towns, which had taken advantage of the prostration of their mistress to throw off her yoke, such as Hysiae and Orniae, were brought back again to their allegiance. It might have been harder to cast out the slave lords Tyrrhens from their Cleopian fortress, But a prophet from Phiglia came and stirred them up against Argos. They took the offensive, endured a defeat, and Tiryns was recovered. Thus re-arising, Argos was able to support the Arcadian cities in a combination against the power of Sparta. She entered into alliance with Tegea, but outside the walls of that city the joint forces of the two allies were smitten by the hoplites of Lacedaemon. Yet the city was not taken, and the epitaph of the fallen warriors told how their bravery hindered the smoke of blazing Tegea from their mountain to the sky. Soon after this we find all the Arcadian cities leagued against Sparta, all except the Mantineans, who were never ready to join hands with their Tegeate neighbours. This time Argos sent no help. The Arcadian League sustained a crushing defeat at Dipaea, and Tegea was forced to submit. Thus, through the energy of the young king Archidamus, Sparta maintained her position. But there were grave causes of anxiety for the future. She had to behold the cynicism of the villages of Elis into a city with a democratic constitution. That was a danger in the west. Regenerate Argos was a danger in the east. And even in Arcadia, Sparta was constrained reluctantly to recognize the new cynicism of the Mantinean villages, as a mark of gratitude to the community for holding aloof from the Arcadian League. Thus it was not given to Sparta to strike out a new path. The Persian War left her much where she was before. She had, if anything, diminished rather than increased her prestige, and she had shown the world that she was destined to remain in the old Peloponnesian groove. In the meantime another city had been advancing with rapid strides along a new path, compassing large enterprises and establishing a large empire. The lukewarmness of Sparta, exhibited in her failure to follow up the battle of Mycale, had induced the Ionian and other Asiatic Greeks to place themselves under the leadership of Athens. Thus was formed the voluntary confederacy on which an Athenian empire was to rise. The object was not only to protect the rescued cities from reconquest by the barbarian, but also to devastate the country of the great king, in order to obtain by rapine a set-off against the expenses and losses of the war. The treasury of the League was established in the sacred island of Delos, the ancient centre of Ionian worship, and it was hence called the Confederacy of Delos. The recapture of Sestos was its first achievement. The League included the Ionian and Aeolian cities of Asia, the islands adjacent to the coast from Lesbos to Rhodes, a large number of towns on the Propontis, and some in Thrace, most of the Cyclades, and Euboea, except its southern city, Carystus. It was a league of sea states, and therefore the basis of the contract was that each state should furnish ships to the common fleet. But most of the members were small and poor. Many could not equip more than 1 or 2 ships. Many could do no more than contribute a part of the expenses to the furnishing of a single galley. To gather together a number of small and scattered contingents at a fixed time and place was always a matter of difficulty, nor was such a miscellaneous armament easily managed. It was therefore arranged that the smaller states, instead of furnishing ships, should pay a yearly sum of money to a common treasury. It is uncertain how the amount of these payments was fixed. It seems probable that a calculation was made that all the states, which undertook to pay in money, ought to have been able to contribute between them 100 ships, and that the annual sum of 460 talents was taken as the equivalent of this contribution. Then a careful estimate was made of the resources and capacities of each city, and that sum was proportionately distributed among them. The valuation of the wealth of the confederate cities and the determination of the contribution of each was a work of great difficulty and responsibility, and it was devolved upon Aristides, whose discretion, and the respect in which he was held, fitted him eminently for the task. His valuation remained in force for more than 50 years. Thus from the very beginning the confederacy consisted of 2 kinds of members, those who furnished ships and those who paid an equivalent in money, a pharos, as it was called, and the second class was far the larger. For besides those who could only furnish a ship, or 2, or even part of a ship, many of the larger cities preferred the system of payments, which did not oblige their burghers to leave home. The tribute was collected by 10 Athenian officers who bore the title of Hellenotome, the treasurers of the Greeks. The council of the confederates met at Delos, where the treasury was, and each member had an equal voice. The large number of votes enabled Athens easily to control the proceedings of the council. She would influence the smaller states, and the number of these votes overcame the weight of any opposition which the larger states could offer. As leader of the confederacy, Athens had the executive entirely in her hands, and it was of the highest significance that the treasurers were not selected from the whole body of confederates, but were Athenian citizens. Thus, from the first, Athens held in her hands the means of gradually, and without any violent revolution, transforming the naval union into a naval empire. While the name of Aristides is connected most closely with the foundation of the confederacy, there is no doubt that it was due to its rival Themistocles that Athens took the tide of fortune at the flood. Themistocles had made his city a sea power, and this feat approved him the greatest of statesmen. He was a man of genius. The most reserved of all historians, Thucydides, turns aside to praise his unusual natural gifts, his power of divining what was likely to happen, and his capacity for dealing with difficult situations. We should have expected that the guidance of the policy of Athens, the organization of the new confederacy, would have been entirely entrusted to Themistocles. Half a century later, when the democratic development of Athens had advanced farther, this would probably have been the case. But at this time a man without powerful connections could not long maintain his influence over the people. Themistocles had no party behind him, and the exceptional ability of the man is shown by nothing so much as by the fact that, in spite of this disadvantage, he played such a great part. His rivals, Aristides and Xanthippus, were representative of the old and considerable party of the coast, which was associated with the family of Megacles and Cleisthenes, to which the wife of Xanthippus belonged. They are the leaders at Platae and Mycale. The name of Themistocles does not appear in the second year of the Persian War. The circumstance that Themistocles was not a party leader, that there was no protracted period during which Athens submitted to his influence, might easily lead us to underrate his importance. Though he was not formally or officially the founder of the confederacy, yet when Athens undertook the leadership and entered upon the new paths which then opened out before her, she was under the spell of a spirit which he had been the clearest and earliest interpreter. But his influence had not yet passed away, and while the fleet was building an empire in the east, there was work for him to do amid the ruins of Athens. The Fortification of Athens and the Piraeus. Themistocles, as we saw, made Athens a sea power. Under his guidance she threw her chief energy into the development of a navy, but if she had followed that guidance more fully, she would now have cut herself more boldly adrift from the ties which attached her to the continent. It often occurred to the Athenians to regret that Athens was not an island. If we were islanders, they thought, we could defy the world. There would always be the Boeotian and the Megarian frontiers. But if a series of strong fortresses had been regularly maintained on those frontiers, and if Athenian politicians had resolutely eschewed a continental policy, it might have been possible to spend practically all their strength on their ships. In any case, when Athens decided to enter upon a new career, her true policy would have been to come down to the Piraeus. She should have left her old city round the Acropolis and migrated to the shore of the sea, which was henceforward to shape her history. The position of the Acropolis was a fatality for Athens. It was too far from the sea, and at the same time too near. If it had been as far from the coast as Acharnae, the citizens would almost certainly at this period have transferred their hearths and temples to the hill of Munichia and the shores of the Piraeus. But it was near enough to admit of tolerably quick communication with the harbour, and this geographical circumstance at once saved the old town and weakened the new city. Expediency will induce a monarch, but nothing except necessity will persuade a free people to take the monumentous resolution of leaving the spot where the homes and temples of the community have stood for centuries, the place associated with their dearest memories, their hopes, and their fears. Had Themistocles been a tyrant, we may venture to suppose that he would have left Athens unfortified, built his palace on Munichia, and made Piraeus the centre of government, the city, so that in a few years the old town would have sunk into decay. But since Athens was to remain as before, notwithstanding the new development, and since this new development made the Piraeus of greater strategic importance, it became necessary to fortify and defend two towns within 5 miles distance of each other. After Plataea, the Athenians brought back their families and goods to their desolate habitation. Little of the old town wall was still standing, and they proceeded to build a new wall. The work was done in haste. The material of older buildings and even gravestones was used. The traces of haste can be detected in some of the remains of this wall of Themistocles, near the Dipylon Gate, in the northwest of the city. For it was by the advice and under the inspiration of Themistocles that the work was wrought. It embraced a larger circuit than the old enclosure which Pisistrates had destroyed. On the south side it followed the heights of the Phoenix group of hills, and approached the Ilissus. The Peloponnesians looked with jealousy at the rise of the Athenian walls. The activity of Athens in the Persian war and her strong navy made them suspect her ambitions. But they could not prevent her from strengthening her town. The Lacedaemonians sent an embassy to deprecate fortifications, and to invite the Athenians, instead of fortifying their own town, to join Sparta in demolishing all fortifications in Greece. But they were not in a position to do more than remonstrate. As the name of Themistocles was associated with the wall, it was inevitable that an anecdote should be circulated to illustrate the resources and wiles of the Attic Odysseus. At his suggestion, the Spartan envoys were sent back with the answer that the Athenians would send an embassy. When they were gone, he started himself as one of the ambassadors, but his colleagues were to remain behind till the wall had reached the lowest defensible height. In the meantime, the whole population, men, women, and children, were to press on the work. Having arrived at Sparta, he delayed presenting himself before the assembly, and when he was asked why, he said that his colleagues had been detained, and that he expected them every day. Meanwhile, persons arriving from Athens assured the Spartans that the wall was being built. Themistocles asked them not to be deceived by such rumors, but to send men of their own to discover whether it was true. At the same time he sent a message to Athens with instructions that the envoys from Sparta should be detained till he and his colleagues had returned. The wall had now reached a sufficient height, and the other ambassadors having arrived, Themistocles appeared before the assembly, and declared that Athens had walls and could defend any communication to make. They must deal with us as with men who are capable of deciding their own and Greece's interests. The Lacedaemonians had to put as good a face on the matter as they could. The story has significance in representing Athens as now formally declaring herself the peer of Sparta. The fortification of Piraeus was likewise taken in hand. A thick wall was built all around the Munichian peninsula, keeping close to the sea, and was continued along the north side of the harbour of Catharas, or the harbour as it was simply called, and out to the promontory of Aetonia. The entrances to this chief harbour and to the two small havens of Munichia and Zea on the east side of the peninsula were fortified by moles. In the course of the next 20 years the Athenians came to see the disadvantage of the two towns, which ought to have been won. It was borne in upon their statesmen that in the case of an enemy invading Attica with a powerful army, the communications between Athens and the Piraeus might be completely severed, and the folk of the city be cut off from their ships. In order to meet this danger, which would have been most simply met by deserting Athens, a new device was imagined. It was resolved to transform the two towns into a double town, girt by a continuous line of fortification. Two diverging walls were built to connect Athens with the sea. The northern joined the Piraeus wall, near the harbour, the southern ran down to the roadstead of Phaleron. By these long walls, costly to build and costly to defend, Athens sought to rectify a mistake and adapt her topography to her role of mistress of the sea. But though this device of Athens to conciliate her past history with her future seems clumsy enough, it answered its purpose fairly well. Her naval power was based upon the only sure foundation, a growing naval commerce. This in its turn depended upon the increase of Attic industries, which may be estimated by the enormous number of resident aliens or metics, who settled in Athens or Piraeus for the purpose of manufacture and trade. These metics, who seem to have ultimately approached the number of 10,000, were liable to the same ordinary burdens as the citizens, and when a property tax was imposed in time of war, they were taxed at a higher rate. We may well believe that Themistocles was concerned to encourage the growth of a class of inhabitants who were directly or indirectly so profitable to the community. But in our scanty and vague records of this momentous period, it is impossible to define the activity of Themistocles. We know that he wished to introduce a system by which a certain number of triremes should be added every year, but this idea was not adopted. New ships were built from time to time according as they were needed. But a new system of furnishing them was introduced. The state supplied only the hull and some of the rigging. The duty and expense of fitting the galley, launching it complete, and training the oarsmen, were laid upon the most wealthy burghers, each in his turn. This public burden was called the trierarchy, and the trierarch, who sailed with his ship, was responsible for the good repair of the trireme at the end of the period of his office. 170 oarsmen, composed of hired foreigners and slaves, and partly of the poorest class of the citizens, propelled each galley. There was a crew of 20 men to manage the vessel, including the calustas, who set the time to the oarsmen, and there were, besides, 10 soldiers. As their navy was from henceforth to be the chief arm of their military power, the Athenians were obliged to make a necessary change in the constitution of their highest military command. 2 courses were open to them. They might leave the board of generals as it was, each general being the captain of the hoplites of his own tribe, and institute a new board of admirals. If this arrangement had been made, it would have been necessary to assign to the admirals a higher authority, for the purpose of conducting joint operations by land and sea, so that the position of generals would have been reduced to that of subordinate officers. The other course was, to make the generals supreme commanders, by land and sea alike, and such had been their virtual position during the Persian invasion. This second plan was adopted, and as a logical consequence the generals were no longer elected one from each tribe, but from the whole people, though in actual practice an attempt was made to secure that each tribe should be represented. The old duties of the generals as commanders of the tribal regiments were undertaken for the infantry by new officers, called taxiarchs, and for the cavalry by the phylarchs. The fortification of the city and her harbour was the chief, but it was not the only, work that the masons of Athens were set to do. The Persians had wrecked the houses of Athena on her high hill, and no duty was more pressing for the Athenians, when the danger passed, than to find a dwelling place for the goddess. There can be little doubt that their first thought was to restore the elder temple, the house which she shared with Erechtheus, the place of the precious emblems of the olive tree and the salt spring, if it were only to make it ready in some temporary fashion to receive the ancient wooden image, which had probably been lodged in a secret hiding place. It is not clear that they attempted any complete or partial restoration of the younger temple, the house of 100 feet. Perhaps they simply swept away the ruins. Probably the walls and columns still partly stood, but the roof and all the woodwork had been destroyed, and the sculptures which adorned the pediments had been cast down and shattered. The limbs and trunks of the giants, strewn among the ruins, were cast away into the rubbish heaps, from which they have now been drawn forth recently into new honour, as precious relics of the early art of Greece. In any case, even if they rebuilt in some sort the dismantled temple, the burghers of Athens were not content. They resolved that the lady of their city should have an ampler and more glorious dwelling-house. It was probably when Themistocles was still their guiding statesman that the plan was laid of a second temple near the southern brink of the hill. The foundations of this new temple are still to be seen, but it was never carried out as it was designed. When the time came to rear the walls, the plan was entirely altered, and, as we shall see hereafter, the Parthenon arose on the foundations which were intended for a building of wholly different proportions. End of Chapter 8, Parts 1 through 3. Chapter 8, Part 4 through 6, of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 8, Part 4 through 6. Ostracism and the Death of Themistocles. For some years Themistocles divided the guidance of public affairs with Aristides and Xanthippus. He superintended the building of the walls, and we have already seen how he effectually opposed the designs of Sparta. But the man of genius had his weaknesses. Like most Greek statesmen, he was accessible to bribes, and perhaps he would hardly have cared to tell how he would become a rich man. It was more serious that his vanity betrayed him into committing public indiscretions. He built near his own house a shrine to Artemis wisest in council, on the ground that the counsels which he had offered his country had been wiser than all others. In themselves such things were of little importance, but they conduced to unpopularity, and gave opponents a handle for attack. The time and the immediate causes of the banishment of Themistocles are uncertain. Perhaps he tried to carry through measures which were too revolutionary for Aristides, though Aristides was a decided democrat. At all events he succumbed to a coalition of Aristides and Xanthippus, which was doubtless also supported by Cimon, who was rising into prominence through his military successes. Appeal was made to the trial of Ostracism, and the greater number of 6,000 sherds bore the name of Themistocles. One of these fatal sherds, perhaps, still exists. The exiled statesman took up his abode in Argos. The presence there of such a crafty and active enemy was not agreeable to Sparta, and he was not left long in peace. When the Persian intrigues of Pausanias were disclosed, the Lacedaemonians discovered that Themistocles was implicated in the scandal. But though Themistocles held communications with Pausanias, communications of a compromising kind, it is not in the least likely that he was really guilty of any design to betray Greece to Persia. It is rather to be presumed that those communications were concerned with the schemes of Pausanias against the Spartan constitution. He was accused of high treason against his country, men were sent to arrest him and bring him to trial, and he fled to Corcyra. The Corcyraeans refused to keep him, and he crossed over to Epirus, pursued by Lacedaemonian and Athenian officers. He was forced to stop at the house of Adamas, king of the Molossians, though his previous relations with this king had not been friendly. In these western lands we seem to be translated into a far older time, and to visit the homestead of a Homeric king. Adamas was not at home, but Themistocles supplicated the queen, and she directed him to take her child and seat himself by the hearth. When the king returned, Themistocles implored his protection, and Adamas hospitably refused to give him up to the pursuers. The Athenians, disappointed of their prey, condemned him as a traitor to outlawry, confiscated his property, and dooming his descendants to loss of citizenship. Adamas sent the fugitive overland to Pydna in Macedonia. A vessel carried him to the shores of Ionia. For some years he lay hidden in towns on the Asiatic coast, but when Xerxes died and Artaxerxes came to the throne, he went up to Susa and intrigued at the Persian court. Thus circumstances drove him to follow the example of Pausanias, and by a curious irony the two men who might be regarded as the saviours of Greece, the hero of Salamis and the hero of Plataea, were perverted into framing plans for undoing their own work and enslaving the country which they had delivered. It may well have been, however, that Themistocles, who was an able and far-sighted man, merely intended to compass his own advantage at the expense of the great king, and had no serious thought of carrying out any designs against Greece. He was, as we might expect, more successful than the Spartan schemer. He won high honour in Persia, and was given the government of the district of Magnesia, where Magnesia itself furnished his table with bread, Lampsacus with wine, and Aeneas with meat. Themistocles died in Magnesia, and the Magnesians gave him outside their walls the resting place which was denied to him in his own country. Nor were they content with this; they sought to associate his fame more intimately with their own city. They paid him the honour of a hero, and erected in their market-place a statue of the Saviour of Greece, standing naked in the act of pouring a libation over an altar, below which lay a slain bull. It was not long before this scene was wilfully or ignorantly misunderstood, and gave rise to a false story. Half a century after the death of Themistocles, it was popularly supposed that he had poisoned himself with bull's blood, and the absurd motive of despair at his inability to fulfil his promises to the Persian king was assigned for his self-slaughter. There can be little doubt that this tale, first circulated perhaps by malicious tongues at Athens, was suggested by the bull and the libation dish in the monument of the Magnesian market-place. The Confederacy of Delos becomes an Athenian empire. The conduct of the war which the Confederacy of Delos was waging against Persia had been entrusted to Cimon, the son of Miltiades. We have seen already how he drove Pausanias out of Sestos and Byzantium. His next exploit was to capture Aean, a town near the mouth of the Strymon, and the most important stronghold of the Persians east of the Hellespont. The place was defended to the uttermost by Bogus, its gallant commander, who refused all overtures, and when the food ran out he lit a great funeral pyre. He slew his wife and his children, his concubines and his slaves, and hurled them into the fire. He took all his gold and silver to the top of the wall and flung it into the waters of the Strymon. Then he leaped himself into the flames. Thus the Athenians captured a strong coast fortress, and they were tempted by the rich cornfields and the forest of timber in the neighbourhood to make a permanent settlement at Aean, but the colonists whom they sent forth were destroyed by the Thracian natives. The day for the establishment of the Athenian power on the lower Strymon had not yet come. Doriscus, which commanded the mouth of the Hebrus, was still in Persian hands. The attempts of the Athenian fleet to take it were successfully resisted, and we know not what befell it in the end. Perhaps it fell into the hands of the Thracians. The next enterprise of Cimon was the reduction of the rocky island of Scyrus, a stronghold of Dolopian pirates. While Athens was winning posts on the fringe of the Aegean, it was no less necessary for her to secure intermediate stations, and the importance of Scyrus was its position on the sea road from Athens to western Thrace. The rude inhabitants were enslaved, and their place was taken by Attic settlers. The island was in fact annexed to Attica. But Cimon won less glory by the conquest than by discovery of the bones of Theseus. There was a Delphic oracle which had bade the Athenians take the bones of Theseus and keep them in an honourable resting place, and perhaps there was a legend that the hero was buried in Scyrus. In any case, whether by chance or after a search, there was found in the island a grave containing a warrior's corpse of heroic size. It was the corpse of Theseus. Cimon brought it back to Athens, and perhaps none of his exploits earned him greater popularity. A few years later Cimon achieved what was the most brilliant success of his life. Hitherto he had been busy in the northern waters of the Aegean. It was high time that the fleet should sail southward and strike a blow against the Persian power in the seas of Rhodes and Cyprus. It was not only high time, it was imperative, for Xerxes had equipped a great armament, his last resistance to the triumph of Greek arms. Cimon delivered both the Greek and the native coast towns of Caria from Persian rule, and constrained the Lycian communities to enroll themselves in the Confederacy of Delos. Then, at the river Eurymedon in Pamphylia, he found the Persian army and the Persian fleet, and overcame them in a battle by land and sea, destroying 200 Phoenician ships. This victory sealed the acquisition of southern Asia Minor, from Caria to Pamphylia, for the Athenian federation. The booty which was won in this battle was to be put to the use of fortifying the Athenian citadel, which the Persians had dismantled. Themistocles, who laid his hopes on the Piraeus, would have been content that the Acropolis should have remained unwalled. But the conservative policy of Cimon decided that it should become again the fortress of Athens. The south wall was now built out of the spoils of the Eurymedon. It could not be said that the confederacy of Delos had failed to do its work. The victory on the Pamphylian river freed Greece from all danger on the side of the Persian Empire, and Cimon soon followed up his success by reducing some places on the Thracian Chersonese, which were still held by the barbarians. But in the interval between the conquest of Scyrus and the battle of the Eurymedon, the Confederate fleet had been set to do other work. It had been set to make war upon Greek states which were unwilling to belong to the League. The first case was one of pure and simple coercion of a foreign city. Carystus, unlike the other cities of her island, had held aloof from the confederacy, and this anomaly seemed intolerable to Athens, especially as the place was so near to the shores of Attica. Carystus was subjugated, and made, in spite of herself, a member of the League. The second case was that of a confederate state which wished to be a confederate no longer. Naxos seceded from the League, and the fleet of the allies reduced her by blockade. In the case of Carystus, the confederacy could defend its act only by the plea of political necessity. In the case of Naxos, it could reasonably maintain its right of forcing the individual members to fulfill their obligations, until the association should be dissolved by the common consent of all. But both acts alike seemed to be acts of tyrannical outrage on the independence of free states, and were an offence to public opinion in Greece. The oppression was all the worse, inasmuch as both Naxos and Carystus were deprived of their autonomy. They became, in fact, subjects of Athens. They are typical examples of the fashion in which the Athenian empire was built up. Athens was already forcing the fetters with which she would bind her allies. The victory of the Eurymedon left Athens free to pursue this inevitable policy of transforming the confederacy into an empire. The most powerful confederate state on the Thracian coast was the island city of Thasos. Possessing a considerable fleet, it was doubtless one of those cities which contributed ships. Athens was making new endeavours to plant a settlement on the Strymon and to lay hands on the traffic in those regions. Her interests collided with those of the Thracians, whose prosperity largely depended upon their trade in Thrace. A dispute arose about a gold mine, and the islanders revolted. They hoped for support both from Macedonia and from Thrace, since both those countries were interested in excluding Athens from the coast trade of the northern seaboard. They hoped too for help from Sparta, but the Lacedaemonians were hindered from sending succour by a revolt of the Helots. The fleet of the Thracians was defeated by Cimon, and after a long blockade they capitulated. Their walls were pulled down, their ships were handed over to Athens, they gave up all claims to the mine and the mainland, and agreed to pay whatever tribute was demanded. The typical instances of these three island cities, Carystus, Naxos, and Thasos, exhibit the methods which Athenian policy followed in numerous cases which are not recorded. There were now three classes of members of the Confederacy of Delos. There were 1. The non-tributary allies which contributed ships, 2. The tributary allies which were independent, and 3. The tributary allies which were subject. As the Asiatic cities were declining in vigor and disliked military service and absence from home, they mostly preferred to discharge their obligations by paying tribute. It was obviously for the interest of Athens that as many members as possible should contribute money, and as few as possible contribute ships. For the ships which the tribute money furnished out were simply an addition to her own fleet, because they were under her direct control. She consequently aimed at diminishing the members of the first class, and soon it consisted of only the 3 large and wealthy islands, Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. Again, it was to the interest of Athens to transfer the members of the second class into the third, and win control over the internal affairs of the cities. New members which were coerced to join were never allowed to preserve absolute autonomy, and all revolting cities were reduced to the condition of subjection. But the degrees of subjection were not the same. The position of each city was determined by a special agreement with Athens, and the terms of these treaties varied. As a rule, Athens prescribed to her subjects the general form of their constitutions, and it need hardly be said that these constitutions were always democratic. The new constitution which she imposed on Erythrae when that city was forced to join the League has been partially preserved on a stone. But there was no general, hard and fast system. Each city had its own individual arrangements, and its own measure of restricted autonomy. The closer dependence of these tributary states on Athens was in many cases marked by the presence of an Athenian garrison and Athenian civil officers. But there was one burden which was common to all, the obligation of furnishing soldiers to the League in time of war. It was a duty which could be demanded only under certain defined conditions, but it was an innovation which altered the original character of the League as a merely maritime confederacy. It seems probable that Athens tried to extend the duty of military service to her autonomous allies, and that this policy caused revolts, a result which was not unwelcome to Athens, as it gave her opportunities to deprive them of autonomy. Ultimately, all the allies seem to have been liable to military service except the 3 states which furnished ships, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos. As the process of turning the alliance into an empire advanced, Athens found herself able to discontinue the meetings of the Confederate Assembly in the island of Delos. She could now act entirely as she deemed good without going through the form of consulting a body whose decisions must necessarily be hers, as the great majority of the members were her own subjects. The formal establishment of her empire may be dated 10 years after the war with Thessos, when the treasury of the League was transferred from Delos to Athens. This set the seal on the creation of the Athenian Empire. The Confederacy of Delos no longer existed, and although the term alliance was always officially used, men no longer hesitated to use the word empire in ordinary speech. The tribute money thus passed from the protection of the Ionian Apollo to the custody of the goddess of the Acropolis, and in return for her safe keeping, 1 mina for every talent of the yearly tribute was paid into her own treasury. The Athenian Empire embraced the Aegean Sea, with its northern and eastern fringes, from Methone in the northwest to Lycian Phaselis in the southeast. The number of cities which belonged to it at its height was considerably more than 200. We can enumerate more than 260 names from official tribute lists. Large fragments of some of these lists have come down to us in the most trustworthy form, on the original stones themselves. They not only teach us the names of the subject cities, but they tell us the amount of tribute which many of these cities were called upon to pay. At the end of every 4th year, the assessment of the tribute was readjusted, the burden was redistributed, and the evidence of the lists permits us to infer that the total amount of the revenue was maintained at 460 talents, as it had been originally fixed by Aristides. For a few years indeed it was temporarily raised to meet the pressure of exceptional needs, but in general it was maintained, and the accession of new members, instead of augmenting the total revenue, diminished proportionally the contributions of all the cities. Moreover, every member had a voice in the assessment of its tribute, and could appeal, after the assessment had been made, to the popular courts of Athens. One of the most important restrictions on the independence of the cities was the jurisdiction which the Athenians asserted in criminal cases. It was natural that all disputes between Athens and any of her subjects should be decided at Athens, and it was not unreasonable that, if the burgher of any allied community committed an act of treason against the empire, he should be tried in the imperial city. But Athens sometimes claimed further rights of jurisdiction. In a case of Chalcis she enacted that all cases in which the penalty is death, banishment, or the loss of civic rights should be sent for judgment to Athens. In this, as in other matters, there were various arrangements with the various cities, and some doubtless had more freedom than others. In regard to lawsuits arising out of the breach of contract between citizens of Athens and citizens of the allied states, such affairs were regulated by separate international agreements, and decided in the law courts of the defendant city. In this matter, and it was important, Athens could take the credit of not using her power for the furtherance of her own interests, and it may sometimes have happened that an Athenian was treated with somewhat less than fairness, when a subject folk had a chance of indulging their bitterness against one of their masters. The Athenian Empire was dissolved half a century after the translation of the treasury from Delos to Athens. We shall see that it began to decline not many years after it had reached the height of its power. We must remember that the first principles of the political thought and political life of Greece were opposed to such a union. The sovereign city-state was the basis of the civilized Hellenic world, and no city-state was ready, if it could help it, to surrender any part of its sovereignty. In the face of a common danger, cities might be ready to combine together in a league, each parting with some of her sovereign powers to a common federal council, but preserving the right of secession, and this was the idea of the Confederacy of Delos in its initial form. But even such a voluntary and partial surrender of sovereignty was regarded as a misfortune, so that when the motives which induced a city to join a federation became less strong and pressing, every member was anxious to gain its complete independence and resume the sovereign rights which it had laid down. Such being the free tendencies which have swayed the peoples of Greece, it required a mighty arm and a constant vigilance for a ruling state to keep her federation or empire together. An empire, however disguised, was always considered an injustice, a defiance to the political morality of Hellas. A Greek felt it a degradation of his dignity, or an infraction of his freedom, not to be the citizen of a free and sovereign city. And he felt this at many points if he belonged to one of the subject allies of Athens, since their self-government was limited in regard to domestic as well as foreign affairs. However liberal the general supervision of the mistress might be, the alliance with that mistress was a loss of the heart of all good things, liberty, which means the right of governing one's self. If Athens had adopted the policy which was so successfully adopted by Rome, the policy of enlarging itself, by admitting the citizens of smaller states to her own citizenship, she might have built up a more enduring fabric of empire. But such a plan was incompatible with the political notions of the Greeks. Policy and ostracism of Cimon. As the Persian War had brought out more vividly the contrast between Greek and barbarian, and impressed the Greeks with the ideal unity of their race, so the Confederacy of Delos emphasized a division existing within the Greek race itself, the contrast of Dorian and Ionian. That division was largely artificial. It was the result of mistaken notions about the early history of Greece, and only within very restricted limits did it represent any natural line of cleavage in the Hellenic race. But it had come to be accepted as an axiom, and was an important element in the situation. We must probably seek for the origin of the opposition between Dorian and Ionians, as a political doctrine, in the unity of the Peloponnesus. The actual geographical unity produced a political unity, when in the 6th century the Spartan power became dominant, and this was reinforced by the conception of its ethnical unity as mainly a Dorian country. The identity and exclusiveness of Peloponnesian interests had been apparent at the time of the Persian invasion, and the Peloponnesus not only stood aloof from, but had the air of protesting against, the growth of the Athenian confederacy. And this confederacy had taken upon itself from the very first an Ionian colour. Athens, believing that she was an Ionian city, and the mother of the Ionians of Asia, was gathering her children about her. The shrine of the Delian Apollo, the great centre of Ionian worship, was chosen as the centre of the new Ionian Union. The treasures of the league were in the Ionian Apollo's keeping, and in his island the allies met to take counsel together. Thus the Dorian federation of the Peloponnesians, under the headship of Sparta, stood out against the Ionian federation of the Agean, under the headship of Athens. For some years the antagonism lay dormant. Sparta was still an ally of Athens against the Mede, and the danger from Persia had not passed away. But the preservation of peace was also due, in some measure, to the policy of the men who guided the fortunes of Athens, Aristides and Cimon. The son of Miltiades, he had been at first regarded as a youth of little promise. His grandfather was named Simpleton, and he was supposed to have inherited a wit poorer than that of the ordinary Athenian. Fond of the wine-cup and leading a disorderly life, he was not a man of liberal education, and a writer of memoirs, who knew him, described him as Peloponnesian rather than Athenian, uncultivated, but honest and downright. He lived with his stepsister Epinice, and they both affected Lacedaemonian manners. Aristides seems to have discerned his military ability and to have introduced him to public life. His simplicity, geniality, and lavish hospitality rendered him popular. His military successes confirmed his influence. The two guiding principles of Cimon's policy were the persecution of the war against Persia, and the maintenance of good relations with the Lacedaemonians. He upheld the doctrine of dual leadership. Athens should be mistress of the seas, but she should recognize Sparta as the mistress of the continent. Cimon's sympathy with Sparta and his connections there became an important political fact, and undoubtedly helped to postpone a rupture between Sparta and Athens. In this policy Aristides, the leader of the democracy, and Cimon, who was by no means in sympathy with the development of the democratic constitution, had pulled together. After the death of Themistocles they had the whole power in their hands, Cimon being continually re-elected as strategos, and Aristides having the moral control of the sovereign assembly. On the death of Aristides, Cimon remained the most powerful statesman in Athens, but his want of sympathy with democracy rendered it impossible that he should retain this power in a state which was advancing on the lines along which Athens was moving now. Younger statesmen arose and formed a party of opposition against Cimon and the oligarchs who rallied round him. The two chief politicians of this democratic party were Ephialtes, a man of unquestioned probity, whom the oligarchs disliked and feared, and Pericles, the son of Xanthippus, who now began to play a prominent part in the assembly. After the conquest of Thessos, they charged Cimon with having received bribes from Alexander, the king of Macedon, who was supporting the Thracians, and with having failed to act against Macedonia as it was his duty to act. The accusation appears not to have been pressed hard, and Cimon was acquitted. But it was the first movement of an opposition which was speedily to bring about his fall. Meanwhile, Sparta herself had dealt a blow to his policy. When the victory of the Eurymedon dispelled the fears of Persia, which had hovered over Greece till then, Sparta felt herself free to unseal her dormant jealousy of Athens at the first suitable opportunity, and she saw her opportunity in the war with Thessos. But unforeseen events at home hindered her, as we saw, from actual intervention against Athens. The Spartan citizen lived over a perpetual volcano, the servitude of their Perioeci and Helots. The fire which Pausanias thought of kindling burst forth 8 years after his death. An earthquake had laid in ruins the village which composed the town of Sparta, and a large number of the inhabitants were buried in the convulsion. The moment was chosen by the Messenian serfs to shake off the yoke of their detested masters. They annihilated in battle a company of 300 Spartans, but then they were smitten at the Isthmus, an unknown place in Messina, and sought refuge in the stronghold of Ithome. On that steep hill, full of the memories of earlier struggles, they held out for a few years. The Spartans were driven to ask the aid of allies. Plataea, Aegina, and Mantia sent troops to besiege Ithome. They even asked Athens herself to succor them in their distress. The democratic politicians lifted up their voice against the sending of any aid, and the event proved them to be perfectly right. But the Athenian folk listened to the counsels of Cimon, who drove home his doctrine of the dual leadership by 2 persuasive metaphors. We must not leave Hellas lame. We must not allow Athens to lose her yoke-fellow. Cimon took 4,000 hoplites to Messina, but though the Athenians had a reputation for skill in besieging fortresses, endeavours to take Ithome failed. Then Sparta rounded and smote Athens in the face. She told the Athenians, alone of all the allies who were encamped around the hill, that she required their help no more. We are told that the Lacedaemonians were afraid of the adventurous and revolutionary spirit of the Athenians. But it is strange indeed that they should have dealt thus with a force which was both procured and commanded by a friend so staunch as Cimon. This incident exploded the Laconian policy of Cimon, it exposed the futility of making sacrifices to court Sparta's friendship, and it revealed the depth of Spartan jealousy. The opposition of Ephialtes and his party to the Messenian expedition received its justification. And meanwhile Ephialtes and Pericles had taken advantage of the absence of the conservative statesmen to effect a number of radical reforms, which were necessary to complete the democratic constitution. These reforms were extremely popular, and immensely increased the influence of the statesmen who carried them. When Cimon returned with his policy discredited, they denounced him as a Philo-Laconian, and felt that they could safely attempt to ostracize him. An ostracism was held, and Cimon was banished. Soon afterwards a mysterious crime was committed. Cimon's chief antagonist, Ephialtes, was murdered, and no one ever ascertained with surety who the murderers were. He had many bitter foes among the Areopagtes, whom he had attacked singly and collectively, and there were perhaps some among them who would not have hesitated to wreak such a vengeance on their assailant. The Athenians had presently an opportunity of retaliating on Sparta for her contumely. The blockade of Ithome was continued, and the rebels at last capitulated. They were allowed to leave the Peloponnesus unharmed, on the condition that they should never return. The Athenians who had helped to besiege them now found them a shelter. They settled the Messenians in a new home at Naupactus, on the Corinthian coast, a place where they had recently established a naval station. In the Altus of Olympia we may still see a memorial of this third Messenian war, the round base of a statue of Zeus, which the Lacedaemonians dedicated as a thank-offering for their victory, and we may read the inscribed verses in which they besought the Lord Zeus of Olympus to accept the fair image graciously. While the Lacedaemonians were wholly intent upon the long siege of the Messenian fort, the Argives, free from the fear of attack on that side, had seized the occasion to lay siege to Mycenae. In the days of Argive greatness this stronghold can hardly have been other than an Argive fortress, and it was probably after the great victory of Cleomenes with Spartan help that the Mycenaeans won for a brief space their ancient independence. During that brief space they had the glory of bearing a hand in the deliverance of Greece. On the summit of their primeval citadel they built a temple, where the old palace had stood, and they girdled the city below with a wall. They now defended the fortress for some time, but their supplies were cut off, and they were forced to submit. The Argives let them depart whither they would, and some found a refuge in Macedonia, but the old town was destroyed, all except the walls, which were stronger than the forces of destruction. Argos was once more mistress of her plain. End of chapter 8, parts 4 through 6.
Chapter 9, Part 1 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, July 2007. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 9, Part 1. The Athenian Empire under the guidance of Pericles. Section 1. The completion of the Athenian democracy. To the Greeks of Simone's day it might have seemed that the Athenian constitution, as it had been fixed by Cleisthenes and further reformed after the battle of Marathon, was as democratic as it well could be. But the supreme people was to become in still full measure lord in its own house, under the guidance of Ephialtes, whose career was suddenly cut short, and of Pericles, son of Xanthippus, who was to be the most prominent figure in Greece for 30 years. The mother of Pericles belonged to the family, and bore the name of the daughter of the Sicilian tyrant, the Agarista whose wooing had been so famous. She was the niece of Cleanthes the lawgiver, and sister of Megacles, who had been ostracized as a friend of the Pisistratids. The young statesman had a military training, but he came under the influence of two distinguished teachers, to whom he owed much. One was a countryman of his own, Damon of Oa, one of the most intellectual Athenians of his day, and renowned as a master of the theory of music. The other was an outlander and a philosopher, Anaxagoras of Clazomene, whose mechanical theory of the material universe, once for all set in motion by an act of unchangeable mind, freed Pericles from the superstition of the multitude whom it was his task to guide. To these masters the statesman partially owned his intellectual aloofness, but he did not owe them either his political ideas or the gift of lucid and persuasive speech which was essential to his success. He was indeed a striking contrast to Cimon, the loose and genial boon companion. He seldom walked abroad, he was strict in the economy of his household, he avoided convivial parties, and jealously maintained the dignity of his reserved. His portrait was chiseled by Cresselis. It is something to have the round pedestal on which the original image was set, but we also possess a copy of the portrait. It shows us not the lofty Olympian statesman, but the passionless, contemplative face of the friend of Anaxagoras. The most conservative institution in Athens was the Council of Areopagus, for it was filled up with the archons who were taken from the two richest classes in the state. This institution was incompatible with the development of democracy, and it was inevitable that it should be ended or mended. Ephialtes had prepared the way for an attack by accusing individual Areopagites of corruption and fraudulent practices, and then, taking advantage of Cimon's absence in Messenia, he introduced a series of laws which deprived the ancient council of all its powers that had any political significance. Its right to punish the public ministers and officers if they violated the laws, its duties of supervising the administration and seeing that the laws were obeyed, were transferred away and transferred to the people. The censorial powers which enabled it to inquire into the lives of private citizens were abolished. Nothing was left to the venerable body but its jurisdiction in homicidal cases, the care of the sacred olive trees of Athena, and a voice in the supervision of the property of the Eleusinian deities. The functions which it lost passed to the Council of 500, the Assembly, and the popular law courts. All impeachments for crimes which threatened the public weal were henceforward brought before the council or the assembly, and henceforward the people tried in their own courts officials who had failed to give a satisfactory account of their administration. We have a notable monument of the excitement which this radical change caused at Athens, in a drama of Aeschylus which was performed a few years later. The Eumenides describes the trial of Orestes on the hill of Ares for the murder of his mother, and the institution of the court of the Areopagus. The significance of the drama has been often misunderstood. It is no protest after the event. It is no cry to undo what had been done. On the contrary, Aeschylus, so far as his poetical motive permits him to suggest a criticism of recent events, approves of their reform. The Areopagus, he suggests, was instituted as a court, not as a council. Its true purpose is to pass judgment on homicides, like Orestes. The Eumenides was calculated to tranquilize those who, awed by the dark and solemn associations which hovered over the hill of Ares, regarded the attack upon it as an impiety. The dismantling of the Areopagus was an indirect blow to the dignity of the archons, who, by virtue of their office, became Areopagites. About the same time, another step was taken on the path of democracy by making the archonship a paid office. Once this was done, there was no longer any reason for confining the post to the two richer classes. The third class, the Zeugatae, were presently made eligible, and it cannot have been long before the Thetes, whose distinction from the third class seems to have been yearly becoming fainter, were admitted also. The two engines of the democratic development were lot and pay. Lot had been long ago introduced, but it had not been introduced in its purest form. The archons and other lesser officers, and the members of the council, were taken by lot from a select number of candidates, but these candidates were chosen by deliberate election. This mixed system was now abolished, the preliminary election was done away with, and the Council of 500, as well as the archons, were appointed by lot from all the eligible citizens. By this means, every citizen had an equal chance of holding political office and taking a part in the conduct of public affairs. It is clear that this system could not work unless the officers were paid, for the poorest citizens would have been unable to give up their time to the service of the state. Accordingly, pay was introduced, not only for the archonship, but for the members of the council. The payment of state offices was the leading feature of the democratic reforms of Pericles. It was a feature which naturally won in popularity with the masses, especially when it was adopted in the case of the popular courts of justice. At the time of the attack on the Areopagus, Pericles carried a measure that the judges should receive a remuneration of an obol a day. Though the measure had the immediate political object of gaining popular support for the attack on the Areopagus, it was a measure which was ultimately inevitable. The amount of judicial business was growing so enormously that it would have been impossible to find a sufficient number of judges ready to attend day after day in the courts without any compensation. But the easily earned pay attracted the poor and idle, who found it pleasant to sit in court listening to curious cases, their sense of self-importance tickled by the flattering respect of the pleaders. Every citizen who wished could place his name on a list from which the list of judges was selected by lot, so many from each tribe, and the courts were empaneled from this list. It was now to the interest of every Athenian that there should be as few citizens as possible to participate in the new privileges and profits of citizenship. Accordingly, about 10 years later, the rolls of the burghers were stringently revised, and a law was passed that the name of no child should be admitted whose father and mother were not Athenian citizens legitimately wedded. It was a law which would have excluded Themistocles and Cleanthes, the lawgiver, whose mothers were foreigners. It was a matter of course that in cases of political character, the judges of the Helicia should be swayed by their own political opinions and by the eloquence of the pleaders working upon their emotions. It was inevitable that the legal aspect of such cases should be often lost to sight, and the facts often misjudged. It was an essential part of the democratic intention that the sovereign people should make its anger felt, and if its anger were sometimes, like a king's anger, unfair, that could not be helped. But it was far more serious that in private cases the ends of justice were liable to be defeated, not through intention, but through ignorance. We can have no better evidence as to the working of the popular courts than the speeches by which the pleaders hoped to influence the decisions of the judges. Litigants at Athens had to plead their own cases. There were no such institution as court advocates. But a man might learn off a speech which had been composed for him by another, and recite it in court. Hence there arose a class of professional speechwriters, and many of their speeches have been preserved. From these models of judicial eloquence we learn how pleaders expected to gain sentences in their favor. To make a large use of arguments which are perfectly irrelevant to the case, a plaintiff, for example, will try to demonstrate at great length that he has rendered services to the state and that his opponent has performed none. There was thus no question of simply administering the law. The judges heard each party interpreting the law in its own sense, but they had themselves no knowledge of the law, and therefore, however impartial they sought to be, their decision was unduly influenced by the dexterity of an eloquent pleader, and affected by considerations which had nothing to do with the matter at issue, and there was no appeal from their judgment. A feature of the American democracy not to be lost sight of is that public burdens were laid upon the rich burghers, which did not fall upon the poor. These were no regular taxes on income or capital, but burdens which were highly characteristic of ancient society, and which might fall to a man's lot only once or twice in his life. We have already seen how trierarchs were taken from the richer classes to equip and man triremes, in which they were themselves obliged to sail, and for which they were entirely responsible. It was a duty which entailed not only an outlay of money, but a considerable sacrifice of time and trouble. There were other burdens also. For example, when the city sent solemn deputation some religious errand, whether to the yearly feast of Apollo at Los, to one of the great pan-Hellenic festivals, or to the oracle of Delphi, a wealthy citizen was chosen to eke out at his cost the money applied for the purpose to the public treasury, and to conduct the deputation and equip it with magnificence worthy of the occasion. But none of the liturgies, as these public buildings were called, was more important or more characteristic of Athenian life than that of providing the choruses for the festivals of Dionysus. Every year each tribe named one of its wealthy tribesmen to be a choregos, and its duty were to furnish and array a chorus and provide a skilled trainer to teach it the dances and songs of the drama which it was to perform. Rivalry spurred the choregi to ungrudging outlay. He whose chorus was victorious in the tragic or the comic competition was crowned and received a bronze tripod, which he used to set up, inscribed with his own name and that of his tribe, upon a pillar or sometimes upon a miniature round temple. On the east side of the Acropolis, leading to the theatre, a long street of these chorigic monuments recorded the public spirit of the citizens, and this street of tripods showed, perhaps more impressively than any other evidence, how much significance the state attached to the theatre and the worship of Dionysus. Never was piety more fully approved as wisdom. The state's endowment of religion turned out to be an endowment of brilliant genius, and the rich men who were called upon to spend their time and money in furnishing the dancers did service to the great masters of tragedy and comedy, and thereby served the whole world. Section 2. War of Athens with the Peloponnesians. The banishment of Simone was a signal for a complete change in the foreign policy of Athens. She abandoned the alliance with the Lacedaemonians and formed a new alliance with their enemies, Argos and Thessaly. The new friendship of the Athenian and Argive people is reflected in the trilogy which Aeschylus composed about this time on the murder of Agamemnon and the vengeance of Orestes. The dramatist plays pointedly upon the alliance, and perhaps it is not undesigned compliment to the new ally that he makes Agamemnon lord of Argos, and not of the newly destroyed Mycenae. So far, indeed, as the main interests of Athens were concerned, she was not brought into direct collision with Sparta. But these interests forced her into deadly rivalry with two of Sparta's allies. The naval empire of Athens and the growth of her sea power were rapidly extending her trade and opening new visions of commercial ambition in all quarters of the Greek world. She was competing with, and it seemed likely she would outstrip, the two great cities of traffic, Corinth and Aegina. With Aegina there had already been a struggle, and now that Athens had grown in power and wealth, another struggle was inevitable. The competition of Athenian merchants with Corinth in the west was active, and it was about this time that an Athenian general took Naupactus from the Ozolian Locrians and secured a naval station which gave Athens a considerable control over the mouth of the Corinthian Gulf. This was a blow which struck home. Athens had now the means of intercepting and harassing the Corinthian Argosites which sailed forth with merchandise for the far west. War was a question of months, and the occasion soon came. The Megarians, on account of a frontier dispute with Corinth, deserted the Peloponnesian League and placed themselves under Athenian protection. Nothing could be more welcome to Athens than the adhesion of Megara. Holding Megara, she had a strong frontier against the Peloponnesus, commanding the isthmus from Pegae on the Corinthian to Nisaea and the Saronic Bay. Without any delay, she set about the building of a double line of wall from the hill of Megara down to the haven of Nisaea, and she garrisoned these quote, long walls quote, with her own troops. Thus the eastern coast road was under her control, and Attica had a strong bulwark against invasion by land. The occupation of Megara was a new offense to Corinth, and it was an offense to the mistress of the Peloponnesian League. War soon broke out, but at first Sparta took no active part. On the events of the war we are ill instructed. We find an Athenian squadron make a descent on Halius, and gaining an advantage over some Corinthian and Epidaurian troops. Then the little island of Cecrophalia, which lies between Aegina and the Argive shore, becomes the scene of a naval combat with Peloponnesian fleet, and the Athenians prevail. At this point the Aeginetans enter the struggle. They saw that if Corinth sustained a severe defeat, their own fate was sealed. Athens would become absolute mistress in the Saronic Sea. A great naval battle was fought near Aegina. The allies of both Aegina and Athens were engaged, and the Athenians, having taken 70 ships, landed on the island and blockaded the town. Thereupon the Peloponnesians sent a force of hoplites to help the Aeginetans, while the Corinthians, advancing over the heights of Gerania, descended into the Megarid, expecting that the Athenians would find it impossible to protect Megara and blockade Aegina at the same time. But they reckoned without a true knowledge of the Athenian spirit. The citizens, who were below and above the regular military age, were formed into an extraordinary army, and marched to the Megarid under the strategos Myronides. A battle was fought. Both sides claimed victory, but when the Corinthians withdrew, the Athenians raised the trophy. Urged by the taunts of their fellow citizens, the Corinthian soldiers returned in 12 days and began to set up a counter-trophy. But as they were at work, the Athenians rushed forth from Megara and inflicted a severe defeat. This warfare round the shores and in the waters of the Saronic Bay is the prelude to more warfare in other parts of Greece. But it is a prelude which has a unity of its own. Athens is opposed indeed to the Peloponnesian alliance, but the war is, so far, mainly conducted by a concert of 3 states, whose interests lie in the neighborhood of the Saronic Bay: Corinth, Epidaurus, and Aegina. These states have indeed the Peloponnesian League behind them, and are helped out by the Peloponnesian ships and Peloponnesian hoplites, but at the same time the war has not yet assumed a fully Peloponnesian character. The year of these successes was a year of intense excitement and strain for Athens. It might fairly be described as an annus mirabilis in her history. The victories of Cecrophalia and Aegina were won with only a portion of her fleet. For in the very hour when she was about to be brought face to face with the armed opposition of rival Greek powers against the growth of her empire and the expansion of her trade, she had embarked in an enterprise beyond the limits of the Greek world. It was an expedition to Egypt, one of the most daring ventures she ever undertook. A fleet of 200 Athenian and Confederate galleys was operating against Persian and Cyprian seas when it was invited to cross over to Egypt. The call came from Inaros, a Libyan potentate, who had stirred up the lands of the lower Nile to revolt against their Persian masters. The murder of Xerxes had been followed by troubles at the Persian court, and it was some time before Artaxerxes was safely seated on his throne. The rebellion of Egypt was one of the consequences of the situation. The invitation of Inaros was most alluring. It meant that, if Athens delivered Egypt from Persian rule, she would secure the chief control of the foreign trade with the Nile Valley, and be able to establish a naval station on the coast. By one stroke she would far outstrip all the rival merchant cities of Hellas. The nameless generals of the Aegean fleet accepted the call of the Libyan prince. As in the days of remote antiquity, the "peoples of the north" were now to help the Libyans in an attempt to overthrow the lords of Egypt. Of those remote episodes the Greeks knew nothing, but they might remember how Carian and Ionian adventurers had once placed the Egyptian king upon the throne. In another way, an attack on Egypt was a step in a new path. Hitherto the Confederate ships had sailed in waters which were wholly or partly Greek, and had confined their purpose to the deliverance of Greek cities, or cities which, like the Carian and Lycian, were in close touch with Greek civilization. The shores of Cyprus, where Greek and Phoenician were side by side, invited above other shores a squadron of Greek deliverers. But when the squadron crossed over to Egypt, it entered a new sphere and undertook a new kind of work. The Egyptian expedition was an attempt to carry the struggle with Persia into another stage, a stage at which Greece was the aggressor and the invader. This attempt was not destined to prosper. More than a century was still to elapse before the invasion of Xerxes would be avenged. But it is well to remember that the Athenians, in moving on Egypt, anticipated Alexander the Great, and that success was not impossible if Cimon had been their general. The Athenians sailed up the Nile to find Inaros triumphant, having gained a great victory in Delta over a Persian army which had been sent to quell him. Sailing up, they won possession of the city of Memphis, except the citadel, the "White Castle," in which the Persian garrison held out. After this achievement, we lose sight of the war in Egypt for more than 2 years, and beyond the protracted blockade of the White Castle, we have no record how the Athenian forces were employed. But it was a fatal coincidence that the power of Athens should have been divided at this moment. With her full forces, she might have inflicted a crushing blow on the Peloponnesians. With her full forces, she might have prospered in Egypt. It was a triumph for the political party which had driven Cimon into banishment, that when half the Athenian fleet was on the banks of the Nile, the hostilities of Corinth and Aegina wherein their friends should have been so bravely repelled. Nothing impresses one more with the energy of Athens at this crisis than a stone which records the names of the citizens belonging to one of the tribes who fell in this memorable year. Quote, "Of the Erectheid tribe, these are they who died in the war, in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Phoenice, at Helalis, in Aegina, at Megara, in the same year." And the names follow. The siege of Aegina was continued, and, within 2 years after the battle, the Aegeans capitulated, and agreed to surrender their fleet and pay tribute to Athens. Few successes can have been more welcome or profitable to the Athenians than this. The island which offended their eyes and attracted their desires when they looked forth from their hills across the waters of their bay, was at length powerless in their hands. They had lamed one of their most formidable commercial rivals. They had overthrown one of the most influential cities of Dorian Greece. In the confederacy, Aegina took her rank with Thasos as the richest of the subject states. For these 2 island cities, the burden of yearly tribute was 30 talents, incomparably larger than the sum paid by any of the other cities whose tribute we know. In the meantime, events in another part of Greece had let the Lacedaemonians themselves take part in the war, and had transported to the main interest of the struggle from the Saronic Gulf to Boeotia. The errand of the Lacedaemonians was an errand of piety, to succor their mother people, the Dorians of the north, one whose 3 little towns had been taken by the Phocians. To force the aggressors to restore the place was an easy task for a force which consisted of 1,500 Lacedaemonian hoplites and 10,000 troops of allies. The real work of the expedition lay in Boeotia. It was clearly the policy of Sparta to raise up here a powerful state to hold Athens in check, and this could only be effected by strengthening Thebes and making her mistress of the Boeotian federation. Accordingly, Sparta now set up power of Thebes again, revising the league and forcing the Boeotian cities to join it. When the army had done its work in Boeotia, its return to the Peloponnesus was beset by difficulties. To march through the Megarid was dangerous, for the Athenians held the passes and had redoubled their precautions. And it was not safe to cross the Corinthian Gulf, the way by which they probably had come, for Athenian vessels were now on the watch to intercept them. In this embarrassment, they seemed to have resolved to march straight upon Athens, where the people were now engaged in the building of the long walls from the city to the harbor. This course was probably suggested by an Athenian party of oligarchs, who were always abiding an opportunity to overthrow the democracy. The Peloponnesian army advanced to Tanagra, near the Attic frontier, but before they crossed the borders, the Athenians went forth to meet them, 14,000 strong, including 1,000 Argives and some Thessalian cavalry. The banished statesman Cimon now came to the Athenian camp, pitched on Boeotian soil, and sought leave to fight for his country against Sparta. The request was hastily referred to the Council of 500 at Athens. It was not granted, and all that Cimon could do was exhort his partisans to fight valiantly. This act of Cimon prepared the way for his recall. In the battle which followed, his friends fought so stubbornly that none of them survived. There was great slaughter on both sides, but the Thessalian horsemen deserted during the combat, and the Lacedaemonians gained the victory. But the battle saved Athens, and the victory only enabled the victors to return by the isthmus and cut down the fruit trees of the Megarid. Athens now desired to make a truce with Sparta in order to gain time. No man was more fitted to compass than the exile Cimon, whose recent conduct had shown that he was the foe of the foes of Athens, even if these foes were Spartans. The people, at the instance of Pericles, passed a decree recalling him, but when Cimon had negotiated the truce, he withdrew to a distance from Athens, with a tact which we might hardly have expected. The Lacedaemonians celebrated their victory by a golden shield which they set upon the gable in the new temple of Zeus, in the Altis of Olympia, as a gift from the spoils of Tanagra. But the victory did not even secure Boeotia. 2 months after the battle, the Athenians made an expedition into Boeotia under the command of Myronides. A decisive battle was fought at Onephida, and the Athenians became masters of the whole land except Thebes. The Boeotian cities were not enrolled in the maritime confederacy of Delos, but their dependence on Athens was expressed in the obligation of furnishing contingents to her armies. At the same time, the Phocians entered into the alliance of Athens, and the Opuntian Locrians were constrained to acknowledge her supremacy. Such were the consequences of Onephida and Tanagra. Athens could now quietly complete the building of her long walls. These brilliant successes were crowned, as we have seen, by the capture of Aegina, and probably about the same time the acquisition of Chosin gave the Athenians an important post on the Argolic shore. But in the far south their arms were not so prosperous. Since the capture of Memphis, no success seems to have been gained, and the White Castle still held out. After an ineffectual attempt to induce Sparta to cause a diversion by invading Attica, King Artaxerxes sent a large army to Egypt under Megabyzus, who was supported by a Phoenician fleet. Having won a battle, he drove the Greeks out of Memphis and shut them up in Propitius, an island formed by a canal which intersected the Canopic and Sebennytic channels of the Nile. Here he blockaded them for 18 months. At last he drained the canal and turned aside the water so that the Greek ships were left high and dry, and almost the whole island was reconnected with the banks. Thus the Persians were able to march across the island. The Greeks, having burned their ships, returned to Byblos, where they capitulated to Megabyzus and were allowed to depart. A tedious march brought them to friendly Cyrene, where they found means of returning to their homes. Anairos, who kindled the revolt, was crucified, though his life had been spared by the terms of the capitulation. Soon afterwards, a relief squadron of 50 triremes arrived from Athens. It was attacked by the powerful Phoenician fleet in the Mendesian mouth of the Nile, and only a few ships escaped. The Persian authority was restored throughout the land. The day for Greek control of Egypt had not yet come. But though the Athenians lost ships and treasures along this daring, ill-fated enterprise, their empire was now at the height of its power. They were even able to make the disaster in Egypt a pretext for converting the Delian Confederacy into an undisguised Athenian empire. The triumphant Persian fleet might sail into the Aegean Sea. Delos was not a safe treasury. The funds of the League must be removed to the Athenian Acropolis. The empire of Athens now included a continental as well as a maritime dominion. The two countries which marched on her frontiers, Boeotia and Megara, had become her subjects. Beyond Boeotia, her dominion extended over Phocis and Locris to the pass of Thermopylae. In Argos, her influence was predominant. Aegina had been added to her Aegean empire, the ships of Aegina to her navy. Through the subjection of Megara, the conquest of Aegina, and the capture of Chosin, the Saronic Bay had almost been converted into an Attic lake. The great commercial city of the Isthmus was the chief and most dangerous enemy of Athens, and the next object of the policy of Pericles was to convert the Corinthian Gulf into an Attic lake also, and so hem in Corinth on both of her seas. The possession of the Megarid and Boeotia, especially the station at Naupactus, gave Athens control of the northern shores of the Gulf from within the gate up to the Isthmus. But the southern seaboard was still entirely Peloponnesian, and outside the gate, on the Acarnanian coast, there were posts which ought to be secured. The general Tomides made a beginning by capturing the Corinthian colony Chalcis opposite Patrae. Then Pericles, having conducted an expedition to continue the work of the Ptolemies. Having failed to reduce Sicyon, he laid siege to Oneida, an important and strong-walled mart on the Acarnanian coast, but he was unable to take it. Though no military success was gained, the expedition created a sensation, and it seems to have led to the adhesion of the Achaean cities to the Athenian alliance. It is certain, at least, that shortly afterwards Achaia was an Athenian dependency, and for a few years Athenian vessels could sail with a sense of dominion in the Corinthian as well as in the Saronic Bay. End of chapter 9, part 1.